In the endless void between stars, where ancient civilizations rise and fall like distant echoes, humanity stands as the galaxy's greatest anomaly. Not because of superior technology or overwhelming firepower, but because of something far more dangerous to the established order: their inexplicable need to help the helpless. When Marcus Chun, a simple human cargo hauler, stops his ship to rescue what appears to be an abandoned alien child on a dying world, he has no idea that this single act of compassion will shatter diplomatic protocols that have kept the galaxy stable for millennia. The child isn't just any alien. She's the daughter of the Vixen matriarch, ruler of the most powerful and mysterious species in the known universe. What starts as a rescue mission becomes a cosmic chess game where the stakes are nothing less than the future of human-alien relations. Because in a galaxy where strength is measured by the ability to conquer and destroy, the humans have just proven they possess something infinitely more terrifying: the power to save what others would abandon, and to love what others fear. Some call it madness. Others call it humanity's greatest weapon. But when a Vixen matriarch herself declares her intention to claim this strange human as her mate, the galaxy will learn that sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is show kindness to a stranger's child. Marcus Chun had seen plenty of dead worlds in his 15 years of hauling cargo across the Outer Rim, but Kepler 442b was different. It wasn't just dead. It was dying slowly and painfully, like watching a beautiful painting fade in the rain. The planet's twin suns cast everything in an eerie orange glow that made the crystalline forests look like they were burning from within. He shouldn't have been here. The shipping manifest clearly stated his next stop was the mining colony on Zirian Prime, 3 systems over. But the distress beacon had been weak, almost missed entirely if not for his ship's overly sensitive sensors. Standard protocol said civilian vessels should report distress signals to the nearest military outpost and continue on their routes. But Marcus had never been good at following standard protocol, especially when lives might be at stake. The beacon led him to what looked like the remains of a small settlement near the planet's equator. From orbit, he could see the scattered debris of what might have been homes or workshops, their organic curves suggesting non-human architecture. The readings showed the atmosphere was still breathable, though barely, with oxygen levels dropping steadily. Whatever had happened here, it had happened recently. Marcus guided his cargo hauler, the Lucky 7, down through the thin atmosphere, landing in a clearing about half a kilometer from the ruins. The ship's landing thrusters scattered clouds of crystalline dust that caught the orange light like ground diamonds. As he powered down the engines, the silence was almost overwhelming. No birds, no insects, no sound of wind through leaves, just the quiet hum of his ship's life support systems. He grabbed his emergency kit and a portable atmosphere scanner before heading to the airlock. The gravity was lighter than Earth's standard, maybe 70%, making each step feel bouncy and uncertain. The air tasted metallic and thin but breathable. According to his scanner, he had maybe 6 hours before the oxygen levels dropped too low to sustain human life. The ruins were even more unsettling up close. The buildings hadn't been destroyed by weapons or natural disaster. They were simply empty, as if their inhabitants had vanished mid-activity. Doors stood open. Personal belongings lay scattered in the street, and strange alien devices still hummed with residual power. It reminded Marcus of those old Earth stories about ghost ships, vessels found floating empty in the ocean with meals still warm on the table. He was examining what looked like a children's playground when he heard it, a sound so faint he almost missed it, a soft whimpering like a frightened animal. Marcus froze, listening intently. There it was again, coming from what appeared to be a partially collapsed building on the far side of the settlement. Moving carefully through the debris, Marcus followed the sound to its source. Behind a fallen beam of what looked like crystallized wood, he found her. The alien child was small, no bigger than a human 5-year-old, with russet fur covering her body and large, luminous golden eyes that seemed to hold far too much intelligence for something so young. Her ears were pointed and mobile, constantly swiveling toward every small sound, and a bushy tail wrapped around her tiny form like a security blanket. She was clearly terrified, pressing herself against the wall and making small, distressed chirping sounds when she saw him approach. Marcus had encountered dozens of alien species in his travels, but he'd never seen anything quite like this child. She looked almost like the foxes he'd seen in nature documentaries back on Earth, but walking upright and wearing what appeared to be a small, intricately woven garment that was now torn and dirty. "Hey there, little one," Marcus said softly, crouching down to make himself less threatening. "It's okay. I'm not going to hurt you." The child's ears flicked toward his voice, and she tilted her head in a gesture that was so human-like it made Marcus's chest tighten. She was obviously intelligent, obviously scared, and obviously alone. Whatever had happened to this place, she was the only survivor he'd found so far. Marcus had always been good with children. His sister back on Earth said it was because he never really grew up himself. He moved slowly, keeping his hands visible and speaking in the same gentle tone he might use with a frightened Earth animal. The universal translator in his comm unit was struggling with her language, if she had one, but body language was often more important anyway. "That's it," he murmured as she stopped pressing herself quite so firmly against the wall. "I'm Marcus. Can you understand me at all?" The child's head tilted again, and she made a soft sound that might have been an attempt at his name. "Marcus." The word came out with a musical quality, almost like singing. Marcus felt his heart clench. Whatever species she belonged to, she was just a frightened child who'd been left alone on a dying world. He couldn't leave her here. The question was whether she would trust him enough to come with him willingly. He reached slowly into his emergency kit and pulled out a water bottle and an energy bar. The water he offered first, holding out to her and miming drinking. She watched him carefully, then crept forward just close enough to sniff at the bottle. Her nose wrinkled. Apparently, human water didn't smell appealing, but thirst won out over caution. She grabbed the bottle with small, delicate hands that ended in tiny claws and drank deeply. The energy bar was less successful. She sniffed it, took a small bite, and immediately made a face that needed no translation. Marcus chuckled softly. "Yeah, they taste terrible, but they'll keep you alive." Over the next hour, Marcus slowly gained the child's trust. She seemed incredibly intelligent, learning his name quickly and beginning to understand some of his gestures. When he pointed to his ship in the distance, she looked where he was pointing and then back at him questioningly. When he mimed flying away, her ears drooped and she made a distressed sound. "I know," Marcus said gently. "You don't want to leave. But this world is dying, sweetheart. There's no one else here, and the air is getting thinner. If you stay, you'll die too." She couldn't understand his words, but something in his tone seemed to reach her. She looked around at the empty ruins, then back at Marcus, then toward his ship. Finally, she made a decision that would change both their lives forever. She stood up, brushed the dust off her small garment with a dignity that was heartbreaking in someone so young, and held out her hand to him. Marcus took her tiny hand in his and felt something shift in the universe. This wasn't just about rescuing one lost child anymore. Something about this moment felt significant, like standing at the edge of a cliff and deciding to jump. But he'd made his choice the moment he decided to follow that distress beacon. The walk back to his ship took longer than expected. The child, he decided to call her Kit until he learned her real name, was clearly exhausted and struggling with the thin air. Twice, Marcus had to stop and let her rest, sharing water and offering what comfort he could. She was braver than most adults he knew, never complaining despite her obvious discomfort. When they reached the Lucky 7, Kit stopped and stared up at the cargo hauler with wide eyes. She'd probably never seen anything like it before. The ship was old and battered, held together with spare parts and stubborn determination, but to her it must have looked impossibly large and alien. Marcus opened the main airlock and gestured for her to follow. She hesitated at the threshold, looking back once at the ruins of her home, then stepped into the ship with the same quiet courage she'd shown throughout their journey. The first thing Marcus did was get her to the medical bay. His ship's medical systems were basic, but functional, designed to handle the minor injuries and illnesses that came with solo cargo runs. The scanner indicated that Kit was dehydrated and malnourished, but otherwise healthy. Her biology was fascinating, definitely mammalian, but with some unusual features. Her body temperature was higher than human normal, and her metabolism seemed incredibly efficient. The scanner also detected something else, something that made Marcus frown at the readout. According to the medical scanner, Kit wasn't just any alien child. The genetic markers suggested she belonged to a species the scanner identified as vulpine noble caste. Extreme caution advised. The database entry was frustratingly brief, mentioning only that this species was highly intelligent, extremely rare, and considered politically sensitive by the Galactic Council. Marcus looked down at the small, furry child who was currently trying to figure out how the ship's water dispenser worked, and shook his head. Political sensitivity was a problem for politicians. Right now, he had a scared, hungry child who needed care. Getting Kit settled took most of the remaining daylight hours. She was endlessly curious about everything on the ship, investigating every corner with the fearless enthusiasm of the very young. She seemed particularly fascinated by the gravitational stabilizers, spending nearly an hour watching the gyroscopic mechanisms spin with rapt attention. Communication was slowly improving. Kit was remarkably quick at picking up basic words, though her pronunciation gave them a musical, singing quality that was actually quite pleasant. She learned water, food, ship, and Marcus within the first few hours. In return, she taught him her name, or at least what sounded like her name. The closest Marcus could manage was Zira, though when she said it, it sounded like wind chimes in a gentle breeze. As the planet's twin suns began to set, casting the landscape in deeper shades of orange and red, Marcus made preparations to leave. The atmospheric readings showed oxygen levels continuing to drop, and he didn't want to risk staying longer than necessary. Besides, he needed to get Zira to a proper medical facility and figure out how to contact her people. That was when he discovered the first complication. When Marcus began powering up the ship's engines, Zira became extremely agitated. She ran to the viewports, pressing her face against the transparent aluminum and making distressed sounds. At first, Marcus thought she was just scared of flying, but then he realized what was happening. She wasn't afraid of leaving. She was trying to tell him something about the planet. Marcus powered down the engines and followed Zira to the viewport. She was pointing at something in the distance, chattering in her own language with obvious urgency. Marcus activated the ship's external cameras and zoomed in on the area she was indicating. There, barely visible in the growing darkness, was another structure. Not part of the main settlement. This was something else entirely. It was larger than the other buildings, with smooth, curved walls that seemed to pulse with a faint inner light. As Marcus watched, he realized the light was moving in patterns too regular to be natural. "Someone's still here," he murmured, and Zira's ears perked up at his tone. She pressed her hand against the viewport and made a sound that was clearly a word in her language, repeated several times with growing emphasis. Marcus didn't need a translator to understand. That was where her family was. The decision to investigate should have been difficult. Every rational part of Marcus's mind told him to leave immediately. The planet was dying, his ship wasn't equipped for extended surface operations, and he had no idea what he might be walking into. But when he looked down at Zira, saw the hope and desperation in her golden eyes, he knew he couldn't leave without checking. "Okay," he said, powering the engines back down. "One more look. But if it's dangerous, we leave immediately." "Deal." Zira didn't understand all the words, but she understood the meaning. She grabbed his hand and squeezed it with her tiny claws, looking up at him with an expression of such trust and gratitude that Marcus felt his heart constrict. He was beginning to understand that this simple rescue mission was going to be anything but simple. Something about Zira, about this planet, about the way she looked at him like he was the most important person in the universe. It all felt like the beginning of something much bigger than one human cargo hauler and one lost alien child. As he prepared to head out into the alien night, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that his life had just changed forever. He thought he was saving her, but maybe, just maybe, she was saving him too. The twin suns finally disappeared below the horizon, leaving the crystalline landscape bathed in starlight. In the distance, that mysterious structure continued to pulse with its rhythmic light, like a heartbeat in the darkness. And somewhere in that building might be the answers to who Zira really was, and why finding her felt like the most important thing Marcus had ever done. He checked his equipment one more time, looked down at the small alien child who was watching him with complete faith in her golden eyes, and stepped back into the airlock. Whatever was waiting for them in that pulsing building, they would face it together. The journey across the crystalline landscape at night was like walking through a dream made of starlight and shadows. The planet's surface was covered in formations that looked like frozen lightning, crystalline structures that caught and reflected the light from the stars above. With each step, Marcus's boots crunched softly on what felt like glass sand, sending up small clouds of glittering dust that danced in the beam of his flashlight. Zira walked beside him, her small hand clasped firmly in his, but her posture had changed completely from the terrified child he'd found hours earlier. Now she moved with purpose, occasionally tugging him in a specific direction or making soft sounds that Marcus was beginning to recognize as guidance. She knew this place, knew where they were going, and, more importantly, she trusted him enough to take him there. The mysterious building grew larger as they approached, and Marcus began to understand why it had caught his attention from the ship. It wasn't just the pulsing light. The architecture itself was unlike anything he'd seen before. The walls curved in impossible spirals, as if the entire structure had been grown rather than built. The surface seemed to be made of the same crystalline material as the planet's natural formations, but it moved with a subtle flow that suggested it was somehow alive. "This is where your family is?" Marcus asked softly, and Zira looked up at him with those enormous golden eyes and nodded solemnly. She pointed to the building and said something in her musical language, repeating one word several times, Uthamir. Marcus's universal translator finally caught something, offering a rough approximation. Sacred place or place of mothers. That sent a chill down his spine. In his experience, places with names like that were either very good or very dangerous, and he was beginning to suspect this might be both. As they drew closer, Marcus could see that the pulsing light was coming from symbols carved into the building's walls. The symbols were beautiful and complex, flowing like written music, and they glowed with a soft blue-white radiance that seemed to respond to their approach. When Zira stepped within about 10 meters of the walls, the light grew brighter and the pulsing rhythm increased. "It knows you're here," Marcus murmured, and Zira nodded as if that was perfectly normal. The entrance to the building was an archway that seemed to shimmer like water. Marcus approached it cautiously, his hand instinctively moving to the plasma pistol at his belt. He'd never had to use on a living being, but something about this place set his nerves on edge. It was too quiet, too perfect, too much like stepping into a fairy tale that might turn into a nightmare without warning. Zira, however, showed no fear. She walked straight up to the shimmering archway and placed her small hand against it. The surface rippled like liquid metal, and suddenly, the archway was simply an open doorway. She looked back at Marcus and made an encouraging sound, clearly expecting him to follow. Marcus took a deep breath, checked his equipment one more time, and stepped through. The interior of the building defied everything Marcus thought he knew about physics. The space was vast, far larger than the exterior structure could possibly contain, with a ceiling that seemed to stretch up into infinity. Soft, bioluminescent plants lined pathways that spiraled through the space in graceful curves, providing just enough light to navigate without destroying the sense of mystery. But it was the sound that really caught Marcus's attention. As soon as he stepped inside, he could hear something that might have been singing, if singing could be done with voices like crystal bells and wind through silver trees. The sound was coming from deeper in the building, following the main pathway that Zira was already heading toward. "Is that your family?" Marcus asked, but Zira just looked at him with an expression that might have been amusement and kept walking. The pathway led them through chambers filled with things Marcus couldn't begin to understand. Pools of liquid light that seemed to contain moving images. Crystalline formations that hummed with harmonious tones when they walked past. Gardens of plants that glowed in colors that didn't exist in human color theory, shifting through spectrums that made his eyes water if he looked at them too long. But strangest of all were the sculptures, if that's what they were. Scattered throughout the building were what looked like abstract art pieces, flowing forms made of the same crystalline material as the walls. It took Marcus several minutes to realize that they weren't sculptures at all. They were cocoons. Something was growing inside them, something that occasionally shifted and caused the crystalline shell to pulse with light. "Zira," Marcus said carefully, What is this place? But Zira had stopped walking and was looking ahead with an expression of wonder and excitement that made Marcus's protective instincts flare. Following her gaze, he saw what had captured her attention, and his breath caught in his throat. At the center of the vast space was a raised platform, and on that platform stood three figures that were clearly adult members of Zira species. They were tall and elegant, with the same russet fur and pointed ears as Zira, but their bearing was regal in a way that spoke of authority and power. They wore robes that seemed to be woven from starlight itself, shifting and flowing with colors that had no names. But it was the one in the center that made Marcus's heart start pounding. She was clearly the leader, standing with a grace and dignity that would have been impressive in any species. Her fur was a deeper red than Zira's, with silver threads running through it like veins of precious metal. Her golden eyes held an intelligence that seemed to see through layers of reality that Marcus couldn't even imagine. When she saw Zira, her entire demeanor changed. The regal composure cracked, revealing something raw and desperate underneath. She made a sound that was part song, part cry of relief, and suddenly Zira was running toward her, calling out in her musical language. Marcus watched as Zira launched herself into the arms of the tall figure, who caught her and held her close with an intensity that spoke of fear and love and overwhelming relief. The other two figures crowded around, touching Zira gently and making soft sounds that needed no translation. This was a family reunion, and Marcus felt like an intruder witnessing something intensely private. He was about to step back to give them privacy for their reunion when the central figure looked up and locked eyes with him. Marcus felt like he was being examined by something vast and alien and incredibly powerful. Those golden eyes seemed to see through him completely, reading his intentions, his character, his very soul in a way that was both terrifying and strangely comforting. Then she did something that changed everything. Still holding Zira, she walked toward Marcus with a fluid grace that made him think of water flowing downhill. When she reached him, she stopped about arm's length away and looked at him for a long moment that felt like hours. Then she knelt. Marcus was so stunned he nearly stepped backward. This clearly powerful, clearly important being was kneeling before him, a human cargo hauler who'd simply been in the right place at the right time. But before he could say anything, she began to speak. The words were in her own language, flowing like music, but somehow Marcus understood everyone. Whether it was the building translating for them or something else entirely, he could suddenly comprehend not just her words, but the emotions behind them. "You saved my daughter," she said, and her voice was like silver bells in a gentle wind. "You found her when we could not, protected her when we were unable, brought her home when we had lost hope. There is no gift, no treasure, no honor we could offer that would be sufficient payment for this service." Marcus felt his face heat up. "Ma'am, I don't need payment. I couldn't leave a child alone on a dying world. Anyone would have done the same thing." The tall figure tilted her head, and Marcus caught a glimpse of where Zira had gotten that particular gesture. But there was something in her expression that suggested she found his words both admirable and naive. "No," she said simply. "Anyone would not. We have been searching for 3 cycles of the inner moon, calling to every ship that passed, pleading for aid. 47 vessels detected our distress signals. 47 chose to report them to authorities and continue on their routes. You were the first to stop, the first to look, the first to care enough to search for survivors rather than assume there were none." Marcus felt something cold settle in his stomach. 47 ships passed by. The Galactic Council declared this world a quarantine zone when the ecological collapse began. One of the other figures said, stepping forward. This one was slightly smaller than the leader, with silver fur and eyes like emeralds. "Standard protocol is to report any distress signals and allow military vessels to handle evacuations. Civilian ships are discouraged from landing." But the evacuation never came, the third figure added, their voice heavy with bitterness. This one had dark fur with golden highlights and an air of barely contained anger. "The council decided our people were too few to justify the expense of a rescue mission. We were classified as acceptable losses. Marcus felt anger rise in his chest like molten metal. They left you to die because you weren't worth saving? The leader nodded solemnly. My people have always been few in number. We do not conquer worlds or build vast fleets. We are scholars and artists, teachers and healers. The council considers us a minor species of little strategic value. She paused, looking down at Zira, who was listening to every word with those impossibly intelligent eyes. When the ecological disaster began, they offered to evacuate our essential personnel, a handful of our greatest scholars and artists. The rest of us, including all children under the age of maturity, were deemed non-essential. That's monstrous, Marcus said quietly. That is politics, the leader replied. But you stopped for one lost child. You risked your life, your ship, your safety for someone you had never met, someone whose species you had never encountered. She stood, and Marcus realized she was nearly a foot taller than him. You did something that 47 other beings considered not worth their time. Marcus looked down at Zira, who was watching the conversation with bright, attentive eyes. She's just a kid. Of course I stopped. The leader exchanged glances with her companions, and Marcus caught something in their expressions that made him nervous. There was too much significance in those looks, too much weight being placed on what he considered a simple moral decision. May I know your name, savior of my daughter? The leader asked formally. Marcus Chun. And she's not just your daughter, is she? You're someone important. A smile crossed the leader's face, and it was like watching starlight dance on water. I am Valen, first mother of the Kithira, speaker for the silent, guardian of the deep ways. She paused, then added with gentle humor, and yes, you are correct. I am Zira's mother, and I am what your people would call a queen. Marcus felt the universe tilt slightly around him. A queen. The queen, corrected the silver-furred figure. There has been only one ruler of the Kithira for the past 3,000 of your years. Valen is that ruler. Marcus looked down at Zira, then back at Valen, then down at Zira again. So when I rescued her, you rescued the heir to the oldest continuous monarchy in the known galaxy, the dark-furred figure said dryly. The daughter of the being who controls more trade routes, more strategic resources, and more advanced technology than any other single individual in council space. And more than that, Valen said softly, you rescue my heart, my only child, the future of my entire people. Marcus sat down heavily on what turned out to be a convenient crystalline formation. This was so far beyond anything he'd prepared for that his brain was struggling to process it. He thought he was saving one lost kid. Instead, he'd apparently stumbled into the most politically sensitive rescue in galactic history. The question now, Valen continued, is what we do with this unprecedented situation. You have created what your human diplomats would call a significant complication. I have. You have shown kindness to my daughter when the entire galactic community abandoned us. You have proven that at least one human possesses the moral courage that 47 others lacked. Most importantly, you have created a debt that cannot be repaid through normal diplomatic channels. Marcus felt a growing sense of unease. What kind of debt? Valen looked at him with those impossibly deep golden eyes, and Marcus saw something there that made his heart skip. It wasn't just gratitude. It wasn't just respect. It was something far more personal and far more dangerous. Among my people, she said carefully, there are laws older than star travel. Sacred obligations that cannot be ignored or dismissed. When someone saves the life of a royal heir through personal sacrifice and moral courage, certain protocols are activated. What kind of protocols? Valen glanced at her companions, then back at Marcus. When she spoke, her voice was gentle but carried the weight of absolute finality. Marcus Chun, savior of my daughter, you have proven yourself worthy in the eyes of my people. By ancient law and sacred tradition, I am bound to offer you the greatest honor my bloodline can bestow. She paused, and Marcus felt the universe hold its breath. I offer you the right to join our family, to become my mate and consort, to rule beside me as king of the Kithira. The silence that followed was so complete that Marcus could hear his own heartbeat. Zira looked back and forth between them with bright, curious eyes. The other two figures watched with expressions that suggested this was exactly what they'd expected to happen. And Marcus, simple cargo hauler from the Outer Rim, sat there trying to figure out how rescuing one lost child had somehow turned into a marriage proposal from an alien queen. "I'm sorry," he said finally. "Could you repeat that? Because I think I just hallucinated that you proposed to me." Valen's smile was gentle and patient and absolutely terrifying in its implications. "You heard correctly, Marcus Chun. Will you accept?" Marcus stared at Valen for what felt like several geological ages, his brain struggling to process what had just happened. The beautiful alien queen stood before him with perfect composure, apparently waiting for his response to what was possibly the most insane marriage proposal in galactic history. Around them, the crystalline building hummed with soft harmonies, and Zira watched the proceedings with the bright-eyed attention of a child witnessing something momentous. "You want to marry me?" Marcus said slowly, testing the words to see if they made any more sense when he said them out loud. They didn't. "It is not a matter of want," Valen replied, though something in her expression suggested that might not be entirely true. "It is a matter of law, tradition, and honor. You have performed a service for my bloodline that places you in a category that has not been invoked for over 6 centuries. The silver-furred figure stepped forward. "Perhaps we should explain the historical context," she said gently. "I am Thyra, keeper of ancient ways and advisor to the First Mother. The law Valen speaks of dates back to the early days of our civilization, when acts of pure moral courage were considered the highest possible virtue." "Moral Kitty," Marcus repeated weakly. "You risked your life and freedom to save a child who was not your own, who belonged to a species you had never encountered, with no possibility of reward or recognition," the dark-furred figure explained. They had introduced themselves as Kale, war singer, and protector of the royal line. In ancient times, such individuals were considered blessed by the spirits of our ancestors. Marrying them into the royal bloodline was believed to strengthen the moral foundation of the entire people. Marcus looked at Zira, who seemed to find his confusion amusing. "Let me get this straight. Because I couldn't leave a kid alone to die, ancient alien law says I'm marriage material for royalty?" "Essentially, yes," Thyra said with what might have been sympathy, though it is important to understand that this is not merely about ancient law. The Kithira are facing an unprecedented crisis. Valen's expression grew grave. "Show him," she said to Thyra. Thyra gestured toward one of the crystalline formations, and suddenly it began to glow with inner light. Images formed within the crystal, star maps, population charts, data streams that Marcus couldn't fully understand, but which painted a clear picture of decline and desperation. The Kithira were once a thriving civilization, Thyra explained as the images shifted. "We had colonies on 17 worlds, a population in the hundreds of millions, and influence that spanned half the galaxy. But we have always prized intellectual and spiritual growth over military expansion or economic domination." The images showed worlds going dark, population numbers dropping, trade routes being abandoned. "Over the past millennium, we've been gradually marginalized by more aggressive species," Kale added, their voice bitter. "Our peaceful nature was seen as weakness. Our small population was seen as irrelevance. One by one, our colonies were absorbed by other powers or simply abandoned as economically unviable." Marcus watched the data with growing horror. "You're dying out." "We are," Valen confirmed quietly. "This world was our last major settlement outside our home system. When the ecological disaster struck, we had perhaps 50,000 people living here. The Council's decision to abandon us was not just cruel. It was a death sentence for nearly a quarter of our remaining population." "How many of you are left?" Marcus asked, though he was afraid of the answer. "Fewer than 200,000 across all worlds," Thyra said. "And our birth rates have been declining for centuries. We are approaching what your scientists would call a genetic bottleneck. Without significant intervention, we will be extinct within 5 generations." Marcus felt like someone had punched him in the stomach. He looked at Zira, this bright, intelligent, beautiful child, and realized she belonged to a species that was slowly vanishing from the universe. That's why the marriage law exists, isn't it? To bring new bloodlines into the royal family. "Precisely," Valen said. "But more than that, it exists to identify individuals whose moral character might help guide our people through dark times. The ancient law requires that such marriages only be offered to those who demonstrate what we call HFY, the courage to do right when doing right costs everything. And you think I have that? You stopped for one lost child when 47 other beings did not, Kale said simply. You risked your ship, your life, and your freedom to save someone you had never met. You have demonstrated HFY in its purest form. Marcus stood up and began pacing, his mind racing. This was insane. This was impossible. This was the plot of a bad romance novel written by someone with too much imagination and too little sense. But as he looked around the crystalline chamber at the three elegant aliens watching him with expressions of hope and desperation, at little Zira, who was still holding onto his hand like he was the most important person in her world, he began to understand that insane and impossible might not be the same thing as wrong. What would it mean? He asked finally. Hypothetically, if I said yes, what would actually happen? Valen's expression didn't change, but something in her eyes suggested his question had given her hope. You would be formally adopted into my bloodline through the ceremony of stars. You would become my consort and co-ruler with full authority over domestic policy and the welfare of our people. Our marriage would create a formal alliance between humanity and the Kithira, with significant diplomatic and economic benefits for both species. And personally, Marcus asked, surprised by his own boldness. For the first time since they'd met, Valen seemed uncertain. That would depend on what you wished it to mean. The ancient laws require marriage, but do not dictate the nature of that marriage. We could be political partners, close friends, or... She paused, and Marcus caught a glimpse of something vulnerable in her expression. Or we could discover what it means to truly know each other. Marcus felt heat rise in his cheeks. There was something about the way she'd said that last part that suggested the possibility held appeal for her, as well as obligation. But that raised a whole host of other questions. Do humans and Kithira are we biologically compatible? He asked, then immediately wished he hadn't when all three adults seemed to find his embarrassment amusing. Our species share common ancestry in the distant past, Thyra explained kindly. While natural reproduction is unlikely, we are compatible in most other ways. Kithira medical technology could address any physiological challenges. Marcus felt like his brain was overheating. This is crazy. 3 hours ago, I was a cargo hauler with an overdue shipment and a cranky navigation computer. Now I'm being offered the chance to become an alien king and help save an entire species from extinction. Crazy circumstances often require crazy solutions, Valen said gently. But I want you to understand that this is not just about ancient law or political necessity. It is about choice. Your choice, freely made. What if I say no? Then you will be given a ship worthy of your service, enough credits to live comfortably for the rest of your life, and our eternal gratitude. You will also be granted full diplomatic immunity and the personal protection of the Kithira crown for as long as you live. And if I say yes, then you will join us in the greatest challenge any being can face, the attempt to build something better than what existed before. You will help guide a people who have forgotten how to hope. You will be father to the next generation of a species that has survived since before your son was born. Marcus looked down at Zura, who had been following the conversation with obvious intelligence despite her young age. What about her? She's the heir, right? What does she think about potentially having a human stepfather? Valen knelt down next to her daughter and spoke in their musical language. Zira responded with enthusiasm, gesturing toward Marcus and making sounds that were clearly positive. Then she walked over to Marcus and held up her arms in the universal gesture of a child wanting to be picked up. Marcus lifted her carefully, still amazed by how light she was. Zira settled into his arms and said something in her own language, then tried again in English. Marcus good. Marcus stay. Marcus felt something in his chest crack open. This child, this incredible, intelligent, brave little person was asking him to stay. Not because of ancient laws or political necessity, but because in the short time they'd known each other, she decided he was worth keeping. The ultimate choice is yours, Valen said softly. But I hope you will consider not just what this means for our species, but what it might mean for you. When was the last time you had a family? Marcus Chun. When was the last time you had a purpose beyond the next cargo run? Marcus realized he couldn't answer that question. He'd been alone for so long that he'd forgotten what it felt like to be part of something larger than himself. His sister back on Earth had her own family now. His parents were gone, and he'd spent 15 years drifting between jobs and planets with no particular destination in mind. But here, in this impossible crystalline building on a dying world, surrounded by aliens who were offering him something he'd never dared to imagine, he felt like he was finally exactly where he was supposed to be. "Can I think about it?" he asked. "Of course," Valen replied. "But I should mention that there are certain practical considerations that may affect your timeline, such as—" Kale stepped forward with an expression that suggested bad news. "The distress signal that brought you here was not just about evacuating survivors. 3 days ago, a Galactic Council enforcement fleet moved into this system. They intend to destroy this world completely, eliminating all evidence of their decision to abandon us." Marcus felt cold settle in his stomach. "When?" "Tomorrow at midday," Thyras said quietly. "Standard protocol for quarantined worlds that might pose environmental hazards to neighboring systems. They're going to blow up the planet, completely sterilize it," Valen confirmed. "Which means we have perhaps 18 hours to complete the evacuation and to decide whether our people face the future with hope or despair." Marcus looked around the chamber, at the 3 adults who were watching him with expressions of carefully controlled desperation, at the child in his arms who trusted him completely, at the crystalline formations that held the sleeping future of an ancient species. "No pressure," he muttered. Valen's smile was sad, but genuine. "Marcus Chun, I have ruled my people for over 2 centuries. I have faced wars, famines, plagues, and the slow extinction of everything I have ever loved. In all that time, I have never met a being who gave me as much hope as you did the moment you walked through that archway, carrying my daughter. Why? Because you prove that there are still people in the universe who choose to do what is right simply because it is right. Because you demonstrated that kindness and courage are not extinct values. Because you showed me that maybe, just maybe, there is still reason to believe that the future might be better than the past." Marcus felt the weight of her words, the weight of their expectations, the weight of an entire species' hopes resting on his shoulders. It should have been crushing. Instead, it felt like the first time in his adult life that anything he did actually mattered. He looked down at Zira, who was watching him with those enormous golden eyes that seemed to see straight through to his soul. Then he looked back at Valen, this incredible woman who ruled an ancient people with wisdom and grace and was offering to share that burden with him. 18 hours, he said finally. 18 hours, Valen agreed. "And if I say yes, I become a king. Co-ruler," she corrected gently. "We would face the future together." Marcus took a deep breath, held it for a moment that felt like eternity, and made the decision that would define the rest of his life. "Then, I guess we'd better start planning a wedding." The next few hours passed in a blur of activity that made Marcus's head spin. The moment he'd agreed to Valen's proposal, the entire crystalline building had erupted into motion. Hidden passages opened in walls he'd thought were solid, revealing chambers full of Kythera who had been waiting in what Marcus could only assume was suspended animation. The building, he learned, wasn't just a temple or palace. It was an emergency shelter designed to preserve their people's most essential members during catastrophic events. "How many?" Marcus asked Thyra as they watched figures emerging from the crystalline cocoons he'd noticed earlier. 43,000, she replied, making notes on a device that looked like crystallized music. "The eldest and youngest of our people, plus essential personnel. The rest." She gestured toward the dying world beyond the walls. "The rest chose to remain in the outer settlements until the end." Marcus felt a chill. "They stayed behind to die?" "They stayed behind to give the rest of us time to escape," Kale corrected grimly. "Someone had to maintain the atmosphere processors and power systems until the very last moment. It was voluntary." The casual heroism of that statement hit Marcus like a physical blow. An entire civilization facing extinction, and their response was for thousands of people to sacrifice themselves to save the rest. He was beginning to understand just what kind of people he'd committed to joining. Valen appeared beside him, seeming to materialize from the controlled chaos around them. She'd changed into what looked like practical traveling clothes, fitted garments that moved like liquid metal, and somehow managed to make her look both regal and ready for action. "The evacuation ships are being prepared," she said. "But we have a problem." "Just one." Her smile was fleeting. The Council Enforcement Fleet arrived earlier than expected. They've taken position at the edge of the system and are demanding to speak with whoever is in charge of our illegal occupation of a quarantined world. Marcus felt his stomach drop. They don't know you're here. They know someone is here. Our power signatures are too large to hide completely, but they assume we're pirates or scavengers taking advantage of the evacuation. Valen's expression grew grim. If they discover the truth, that I'm here with the royal heir and 40,000 of our people, they'll prevent us from leaving. We'll be classified as refugees and sent to processing centers while they decide what to do with us. And that would be bad because Kythera refugees have a tendency to disappear into the Council's bureaucracy and never reappear, Kale said bluntly, particularly ones with knowledge of strategic trade routes and advanced technology. Marcus was beginning to hate galactic politics with a passion that surprised him. So what do? We run, Valen said simply. But there's a complication with that plan as well. Of course there is. The ancient laws require that our marriage be witnessed by the spirits of our ancestors. In practical terms, that means the ceremony must be performed here, in this sacred place, before we can leave. Without that witnessing, the marriage would not be legally recognized by our people. Marcus stared at her. You want to hold a wedding ceremony while we're being hunted by a military fleet on a planet that's about to be sterilized? Essentially, yes. And if we don't do the ceremony? Thyra stepped forward, her expression apologetic. Then, our people will not accept you as consort. The alliance with humanity will be void, and Marcus Chon will be considered an honored guest rather than a member of the royal family. Which means he would have no legal authority to help guide our people, no access to our most sensitive information, and no right to be involved in decisions about our survival, Valen explained. The offer was made in good faith, but the marriage must be completed according to tradition or it has no meaning. Marcus looked around at the organized chaos of the evacuation. Thousands of Kythera were moving with quiet efficiency, carrying what looked like crystalline data storage devices and pieces of technology he couldn't identify. Children were being carefully guided by adults, their large eyes wide with excitement rather than fear. Everyone seemed to know exactly what they were doing and where they were going. How long does the ceremony take? He asked. Under normal circumstances? 3 days, Thyra said. But the emergency protocols allow for an abbreviated version that can be completed in approximately 2 hours. And how long do we have before the Council fleet decides to investigate more closely? Unknown, Kale admitted. But given their previous behavior, I estimate no more than 6 hours before they lose patience and begin boarding our evacuation ships. Marcus did the math and didn't like the result. So we need to perform a wedding ceremony, evacuate 43,000 people, and escape from a military blockade all within 6 hours. Correct, Valen said calmly. Has anyone mentioned that this plan is completely insane? Several times, Kale replied dryly. But insane plans are often the only ones that work when facing impossible situations. Marcus looked at Valen, this incredible woman who was asking him to marry her in the middle of what was essentially a military crisis, and realized that his answer hadn't changed. If anything, seeing her people's quiet courage and desperate hope had only strengthened his resolve. Okay, he said, let's get married. The next hour was a whirlwind of preparation that made Marcus feel like he was caught in a beautiful, musical tornado. Kythera tradition required that the bride and groom be prepared separately for the ceremony, which meant Marcus found himself in the care of Thyra and several other Kythera who seemed determined to transform him from a scruffy cargo hauler into something worthy of marrying their queen. The process involved ritual cleansing in pools of water that glowed with soft phosphorescence, clothing that felt like it was woven from liquid starlight, and a series of blessings that were sung rather than spoken. Marcus didn't understand most of what was happening, but the reverence and joy of the participants made it clear that this was something sacred to them. The garments will adapt to your physiology within a few hours, Thyra explained as she helped him into robes that seemed to fit perfectly despite being designed for a different species entirely. They're made from adaptive fibers that respond to the wearer's biometric signatures. Adaptive fibers? One of our technological specialties. The fabric actually becomes part of your body's regulatory system, helping to maintain optimal temperature, moisture levels, and even providing basic medical monitoring. She paused, looking at him critically. They also serve as a symbol of the bond between married partners. Once the ceremony is complete, the fabric will resonate with Valen's garments, creating a permanent connection. Marcus looked down at himself. The robes were beautiful, shifting through colors that reminded him of nebulae and distant stars. But more than that, they felt right somehow, as if they'd been made specifically for him. Will I ever be able to take them off? Of course. But while you wear them, you'll always know exactly where Valen is and whether she's in danger. Similarly, she'll be able to sense your location and physical condition. Thyra's expression grew gentle. Among my people, this connection is considered one of the greatest gifts that married partners can share. The idea of being permanently connected to another person should have been terrifying. Instead, Marcus found himself looking forward to it. After 15 years of isolation, the thought of never being truly alone again was more appealing than frightening. When the preparations were complete, Thyra led him back toward the central chamber where the ceremony would take place. But as they walked through the curved corridors, Marcus noticed something that made him uneasy. "Where is everyone?" he asked. The building, which had been bustling with activity an hour earlier, now seemed almost empty. "The evacuation ships launched 20 minutes ago," Thyra replied. "Most of our people are already safely away from the planet. Then, why are we still here?" "Because someone must witness the ceremony, and the sacred laws require that at least one member of the royal bloodline remain to complete the ritual bonding." She paused at an intersection, checking something on her crystalline device. "Valen, Zura, myself, Kale, and perhaps a dozen others will remain until the ceremony is finished." Marcus stopped walking. "You're risking the lives of the royal family for a wedding ceremony?" "We are ensuring the survival of the royal bloodline by legitimizing the succession," Thyra corrected gently. "Without this ceremony, any children born to you and Valen would not be considered rightful heirs. Our people would face not just extinction, but civil war over the succession. And if we die here, then we die having secured the future of our people through your marriage to Valen. The evacuation ships carry enough genetic material and cultural knowledge to rebuild our civilization elsewhere. But they need legitimate leadership to unite them." Marcus realized he was beginning to understand the true weight of what he'd committed to. This wasn't just about marrying Valen or becoming a king. It was about becoming the cornerstone of an entire people's survival. The thought should have been crushing, but instead it felt like the first truly important thing he'd ever been asked to do. They reached the central chamber to find it transformed. The space now glowed with soft, harmonious light that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Crystalline formations had rearranged themselves in spiraling patterns that reminded Marcus of galaxies in motion. And at the center of it all stood Valen. Marcus's breath caught in his throat. She was beautiful in a way that transcended species, wearing robes that seemed to be cut from the fabric of space itself. Stars moved through the material in slow, hypnotic patterns, and her silver-threaded fur caught the light like precious metal. But it was her expression that stopped Marcus in his tracks. Joy, hope, fear, and something that might have been love all mixed together in her golden eyes. "You came," she said softly as he approached. "Did you think I wouldn't? I thought you might realize how insane this all is, and decide to run while you still could." Marcus took her hands in his, marveling at how perfectly they fit together despite their different origins. "Valen, in the past 24 hours, I've rescued an alien princess, been proposed to by a queen, agreed to help save an endangered species, and now I'm about to get married in a crystal temple while fleeing from a military blockade. If I was going to run, I would have done it hours ago." Her laugh was like silver bells in a gentle wind. "When you put it that way, it does sound rather overwhelming." "It is overwhelming. It's also the best thing that's ever happened to me." The ceremony itself was unlike anything Marcus had ever experienced. Kale served as the officiant, their voice rising and falling in harmonies that seemed to resonate through the crystalline structure around them. Thyra and the other witnesses sang responses in their musical language, creating layered melodies that made Marcus feel like he was standing inside a living song. But it was the moment when Valen spoke her vows that truly changed everything. She switched to English, her accent giving the familiar words an exotic, musical quality that made them sound like poetry. Marcus Chun, savior of my daughter, protector of the lost, guardian of the innocent, she said, her voice carrying clearly through the crystalline chamber. I offer you my heart, my crown, my people, and my future. Will you stand beside me as we face whatever comes? Will you help me build something better than what came before? Will you be my partner in hope when hope seems impossible? Marcus felt tears on his cheeks and didn't care. Valen, first mother of the Kithera, speaker for the silent, guardian of the deep ways, he said, trying to match her formal tone, I promise to stand beside you, to protect what you love, to help build the future you dream of. I promise to be worthy of the trust you've placed in me. I promise to love your daughter as my own, and to love your people as my family. He paused, then added more quietly, and I promise to love you if you'll let me. The smile that crossed her face was brighter than all the stars in her robes. I will let you, Marcus Chun. I will let you love me, and I will love you in return for whatever time we are given. The moment their hands touched in the final ritual gesture, Marcus felt something shift in the universe around him. It wasn't just the adaptive clothing bonding to his skin or the formal legal recognition of their union. It was something deeper, more fundamental, a sense of belonging that he'd never experienced before. But their moment of joy was interrupted by an urgent chime from Kale's communication device. The war singer's expression grew grim as they listened to the incoming message. The Council fleet has begun moving toward the planet, Kale announced. They'll be in scanning range within 30 minutes. If we're going to leave, it has to be now. Valen squeezed Marcus's hand. Are you ready to begin your reign as king of the Kithera? Marcus looked around at the small group of aliens who were now his family, at the crystalline temple that was about to be destroyed, at the dying world that had brought them all together. Then he looked at his wife, and felt a surge of determination that surprised him with its intensity. Let's go save our people, he said. And with that, Marcus Chun, former cargo hauler and newest member of an ancient royal bloodline, ran hand in hand with his alien queen toward an uncertain future that suddenly seemed full of infinite possibility. The escape from the dying world turned out to be both more and less dramatic than Marcus had anticipated. Less dramatic because Kithera evacuation procedures were apparently so efficient that they bordered on the supernatural. More dramatic because escaping from a Galactic Council enforcement fleet while protecting 43,000 refugees required the kind of split-second timing and desperate improvisation that Marcus had only seen in adventure movies. Their ship, because apparently being married to the Queen meant he now co-owned a vessel that was roughly the size of a small city, was unlike anything Marcus had ever imagined. The Starweaver was built from the same crystalline material as the temple, but shaped into flowing curves that looked more grown than constructed. It moved through space with a grace that made his old cargo hauler look like a brick with engines. Kithera ships are living entities, Valen explained as they rushed through corridors that pulsed with bioluminescent light. She was carrying Zira, who seemed to find the entire situation exciting rather than frightening. They respond to the emotional state of their crews and adapt their performance accordingly. So it knows we're in a hurry. It knows we're desperate, terrified, and fighting for our lives, Kale replied from ahead of them, which means it will perform beyond its normal specifications until we reach safety or die trying. Marcus was beginning to appreciate the Kithera approach to crisis management. They didn't waste time on false optimism or elaborate contingency plans. They simply acknowledged the reality of their situation and responded with whatever desperate measures were necessary. The bridge of the Starweaver was a crystal cathedral filled with flowing light and harmonious sound. Dozens of Kithera worked at stations that looked like musical instruments, their hands dancing over controls that responded to touch, gesture, and apparently thought. At the center of it all stood a raised platform where Valen took her position as commander. Marcus fell out of place among the organized efficiency until Valen gestured for him to join her at the command center. You're co-ruler now, she said quietly. That means you share responsibility for every decision we make. I don't know anything about commanding a starship. You know about moral courage and making hard choices under pressure. Those are the most important qualifications for leadership. She activated a holographic display that showed their tactical situation. What do you think we should do? Marcus studied the display, which showed the Starweaver and 43 smaller evacuation ships facing off against a Council enforcement fleet of 12 military vessels. The odds were not encouraging. We're outgunned, significantly. But they don't want to destroy us if they can avoid it. Bad publicity. Correct. They prefer to capture us and process us through official channels. Marcus thought about everything he'd learned about Kythera culture in the past few hours. Your people value knowledge and wisdom above military might. What advantages do we have that they don't? Valen's smile was fierce. Show him, she said to Thyra. The display shifted, revealing something that made Marcus whistle softly. Hidden throughout this star system were devices that looked like crystalline flowers, each one pulsing with the same bioluminescent glow as Kythera technology. Navigation beacons, Thyra explained. We've been placing them in strategic locations for over 3 centuries. They create a network of hyperspace corridors that only Kythera ships can access. We can travel through space in ways that other species can't track or follow, Kale added with satisfaction. The Council fleet is looking for us to run toward the outer rim, where they can pursue and capture us. Instead, we disappear, Marcus finished, understanding immediately. But what about the evacuation ships? Can they all access these corridors? That's where it gets complicated, Valen admitted. The smaller ships can follow us, but only if we lead them through the network one group at a time. It would take several hours to evacuate everyone safely. And we don't have several hours. We have approximately 15 minutes before the Council fleet reaches weapons range. Marcus studied the tactical display, his mind racing. There had to be a solution, some way to use their advantages while minimizing their vulnerabilities. Then, he noticed something that sparked an idea. The Council fleet is staying in formation, he observed. They're treating this like a standard refugee interdiction, not a military engagement. Because they don't consider us a threat, Valen agreed. What if we made them reconsider that assessment? Valen's eyes sharpened. What do you have in mind? Marcus gestured toward the display. You said Kythera ships respond to the emotional state of their crews. What happens if we convince the Starweaver that we're not running away? We're attacking. The bridge fell silent, except for the soft harmonies of the ship's living systems. Every Kythera turned to stare at Marcus with expressions ranging from shock to admiration. You want to charge a Council enforcement fleet, Kale said slowly. With a ship that's designed for exploration and diplomacy, not warfare. I want to make them think we're charging them, Marcus corrected. Force them to break formation to respond to what looks like a suicide attack. While they're scrambling to intercept us, the evacuation ships use the confusion to escape through your hidden corridors. And then what? Thyra asked. Even if we survive the initial engagement, we'll still be trapped. Then we disappear too. We lead them on a chase through the corridor network until we can lose them in the deep systems. Marcus looked at Valen. You said this ship responds to the crew's emotional state. How does it respond to the emotions of its commanders? The royal bloodline has a deeper connection with Kythera technology, Valen said slowly. Our emotional state affects ship performance more dramatically than normal crew members. And we're married now. Does that connection extend to me? Valen's eyes widened as she understood what he was suggesting. In theory, yes. The marriage bonds should allow you to interface with the ship's systems as if you were born Kythera. Then, let's find out what happens when a human's protective instincts get channeled through alien technology. The plan that followed was equal parts brilliant and insane. While the evacuation ships prepared to enter the hidden corridor network, the Starweaver began accelerating directly toward the Council fleet. To their sensors, it would look like a desperate gambit by refugees who had decided to go down fighting rather than surrender. Marcus stood beside Valen at the command center, his hand in hers, feeling the ship's living systems respond to their combined emotions. Through the marriage bond, he could sense the Starweaver's consciousness, ancient, wise, and suddenly eager for battle in a way that had nothing to do with its original design. It knows what we're trying to do, Valen said with wonder. It understands that we're protecting our people. More than that, Marcus replied, feeling the ship's systems surge with power beyond their normal limits. It approves. The Council fleet's response was exactly what they'd hoped for. Faced with what appeared to be a suicidal charge by a large alien vessel, they broke formation and began moving to intercept. Their attention focused entirely on the apparent threat, They didn't notice the smaller evacuation ships slipping away through dimensional corridors that didn't register on their sensors. Evacuation fleet has cleared the system, Kale reported with satisfaction. All 43 ships have successfully entered the network. Council fleet is demanding our surrender, Thyra added. They're threatening to open fire if we don't heave to immediately. Time to disappear, Valen said. What happened next will be debated by xenotechnology specialists for years afterward. The Starweaver didn't just enter a hyperspace corridor. It created one, tearing open a passage through dimensions that normal space-time couldn't contain. For a moment that felt like eternity, Marcus experienced what it meant to travel through the deep ways that the Kythera had discovered centuries ago. Space folded around them like origami made of light and time. Reality became fluid, responsive to will and intention rather than physical laws. And through it all, Marcus felt the ship's joy as it carried its passengers towards safety through pathways that existed only because someone had dared to imagine them. When they emerged back into normal space, they were 3-star systems away from the dying world that had brought them together. The Council fleet was nowhere to be seen, probably still searching empty space for a ship that had vanished in ways their technology couldn't explain. Status report, Valen requested, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what they'd just accomplished. All evacuation ships accounted for, Thyra reported. No casualties during the escape. The Council fleet appears to have lost our trail completely. The Homeworld fleet is moving to rendezvous with us, Kale added. Co-rulers, you've successfully evacuated our people from Kepler 442b with 0 losses. Marcus sank into what appeared to be a chair made of crystallized music, the adrenaline of their escape finally wearing off. We did it, Valen agreed, settling beside him with Zira in her arms. The little girl had slept through most of the excitement, apparently trusting completely in the adults around her to keep her safe. So what happens now? Marcus asked. Now we rebuild, Valen said simply. We find a new world for our people, establish new colonies, and prove that the Kythera are not ready to fade quietly into extinction. And we do it together, Marcus added, still amazed by the reality of their situation. Together, she confirmed, leaning against him in a gesture that felt completely natural despite their different origins. Marcus looked around the bridge at the Kythera, who had accepted him as their co-ruler, at the living ship that had responded to his emotions as if he'd been born to command it, at the woman beside him who had trusted him with her heart and her people's future. A week ago, he'd been a lonely cargo hauler with no family, no purpose, and no particular destination. Now he was married to an alien queen, responsible for the survival of an endangered species, and about to help establish new colonies in unexplored space. It was terrifying. It was overwhelming. It was the most important thing he'd ever been asked to do. It was perfect. Your Majesties, Thyra said formally. The evacuation fleet is requesting coordinates for our destination. Where would you like to lead our people? Marcus looked at Valen, and she looked back at him, and in that moment he understood that this was what marriage really meant. Not just the ceremony or the legal bonds, but the shared responsibility for making decisions that would affect thousands of lives. Somewhere new, Valen said after a moment. Somewhere we can build something better than what we've lost. Somewhere safe, Marcus added, where children like Zira can grow up without fear. Somewhere that proves the galaxy is better with the Kythera in it, Valen concluded. As the Starweaver and its escort fleet turned toward the unknown regions of space, Marcus Chun, former cargo hauler, current alien king, and permanent guardian of one very special Fox kit, settled back to enjoy the beginning of the greatest adventure of his life. Behind them, the star system that had contained Kepler 442b flared briefly as the Council fleet completed the sterilization process, erasing all evidence that a dying world had once been home to 43,000 souls. But they were wrong about erasing the evidence. The real evidence wasn't in the ruins or the empty settlements. The real evidence was traveling through hyperspace in a fleet of crystalline ships, carrying the hopes and dreams of the people who had refused to die quietly. And at the heart of that fleet, a human cargo hauler who had stopped for one lost child was learning what it meant to be part of something infinitely larger and more beautiful than anything he'd ever imagined. The universe was vast, and full of wonders. And for the first time in his life, Marcus Chun was exactly where he belonged, protecting the family he'd never expected to find, ruling a people he'd never thought he'd meet, and married to a woman who had shown him that sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is show kindness to a stranger's child. In the distance, new stars beckoned with the promise of worlds yet to be discovered and futures yet to be built. And the Star Weaver, responding to the hopes and dreams of its passengers, sang soft harmonies as it carried them all toward whatever came next. The rescue was complete. The adventure was just beginning.